So I am really excited for this one. Today I am talking with Matt Baker White, the executive director for the Wild Rockies Field Institute in Montana. And WFRI is all about, I guess, field-based education. I think kind of backpacking, critical thinking, and some really pretty incredible student experiences all rolled into one. Matt has been leading the charge there, not just in running programs, but also launching their first ever major fundraising campaign, which we are definitely going to talk about later today, growing enrollment and just staying grounded in what makes the work important. So instead of me telling you more, let's get into it. Matt, welcome.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me on here.
All right, I'm going to start with a real easy one. What is your favorite place to recharge in the outdoors?
Oh, that's a good one. I think recently my one of my favorite places has just been in my backyard. I have an incredible backyard. It backs up to a kind of a steep slope covered in ponderosa pine trees, and just sitting on the back deck and being in nature is rejuvenating, and it's low stress for me. I've got all kinds of amazing wildlife, seen foxes and saw a moose out the back door this spring, and deer, and we've seen a bobcat and a mountain lion. So a lot of amazing wildlife to look for, and just kind of a low key spot at home to recharge.
I am very jealous. There's clearly a difference there between Montana and Long Island, New York here. I am looking at my backyard. I'm very happy looking at my vegetable garden. And then it only goes about 15 feet. And then I'm looking at other houses and maybe a squirrel and some birds and things like that. And I think, I love photography, but it's just not that exciting around here as far as the wildlife. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
totally. Yeah. I'm very privileged to have the backyard that I do, and try and make time and space to enjoy it when I can.
awesome. So Matt, I think you and I first met via Zoom, and I think it was 2024, and then luckily we're able to get together live in downtown Manhattan a couple of months ago for a lunch, which was awesome. So, and I've read a lot of the materials on WRFI, so I think I have a pretty good feel for what you're all about, but a lot of people don't. So for those who don't know WRFI, how would you describe what you do and why it matters?
Yeah, definitely. So we recently had one of our courses end, our Cycle the Rockies course and our Restoration Ecology courses both end at the same time. And our students at the end of every course, they get up and present. And one of our students on Cycle the Rockies this year said the line that's like the favorite thing that students say when they end a course, which is she got up and said, "I have way more questions than answers after doing this course." And I'm a big believer that in education, most of what we do is not provide students with answers. Most of what we do is challenge students to ask questions that they haven't been asking or maybe didn't know it existed before they took a course. And if we have the answers, that's great. We can give them the answers and move on. But most of the questions in the adult world are really hard and not clear what the answers are. So I think what we do is we bring students into the world, into environments where they maybe haven't been, to learn about environmental issues, to learn about social and community challenges that exist, and challenge them to ask questions that maybe they didn't start out the course knowing they need to be asking. I think a good example of that, we look like an outdoor education program. We sleep in tents every night. Students are backpacking or cycling or paddling. I think what sets our work apart is that we are engaged on a daily basis with local communities. So we're visiting regenerative ranchers, we're visiting coal mines, we're visiting industrial facilities, we're visiting activists and politicians and elected officials. And students are taking all of these different perspectives, blending them with our instructors who all have advanced degrees. They're college professors and practitioners in the world. And they're interpreting that information and processing that with academic papers, with literature to come up with new conclusions. So on that course, Cycle the Rockies, I had the opportunity to go out and join them for a day. I wasn't able to ride a bike the whole day, but I did drive out and met them when they were doing a tour of a cement facility. So it was a 450-foot long, just this incredible industrial complex that we walked through for 3 hours with an environmental specialist and a production manager. But a 450-foot long cement kiln that's taking limestone and other minerals and metals, melting at the molecular level to make Portland cement that then goes into concrete across the state. And it burns 6.5 kilowatts of electricity plus a whole bunch of coal every day. And our students had the opportunity to learn about sort of the environmental impact of that and the environmental processes and regulations that the state has, federal regulations, and how all of those pieces tie together with the energy grid and with public policy, which is what that course is focused on, is renewables and kind of the energy transition in Montana these days, and how all those systems work together. And it just, I mean, it was a mind blowing experience for me. I mean, I have never thought about when I go to Home Depot and buy a bag of Quikrete where it comes from, but also for these students to realize that, the entire output of this facility for a year would only build 200 wind towers in terms of the concrete bases. There's a huge investment in that we're making in the energy grid, that maybe isn't being accounted for when we put renewables up on kind of a pedestal. Um, I've gotten off track here, but kind of back to the what's important part of what we do and like why I'm such a big believer in it is that, those students next year are going to be sitting in a classroom back on their home campuses, and they're going to be learning about, some kind of renewable energy project. And someone else in their class is going to stand up and say, well, I think renewables are so great and it's the solution to the future and it's the way we have to go forward. And like, we should just build so many more wind towers. And in the back of our students' minds that have been on this course, they're going to say, okay, that's great. And also, where's the concrete coming for that wind tower? What are the systems and the processes? How much oil is being, extracted to make the wind turbine blades? What's the impact on local ranchers in the local community when there's a wind farm that only provides 2 jobs compared to a coal mine that provides 150 jobs? All of those questions start to come into play when students have been in community, have heard from people directly, start to really understand the full impact of systems and processes and all of that. And so I think that's just, really exciting to me that we are giving students that gift of asking questions, not just knowing answers.
Yeah, that is incredible. I love the fact that you mix, instructor teachings with this real life experience. I mean, the folks they get to interact with, you named all the different types of interactions they have. It's just you can't match that in a classroom setting. It's unbelievable. And I think, the why it matters, you answered it. You're creating leaders of tomorrow, and that's why it matters, because those folks can create systemic change because, they're going through these programs and it's just opening their minds to, like you said, more questions. Now, you're not giving them all the answers. You're making them understand what kind of questions they have to ask. And I think that's really the important part behind what WRFI is doing. So it's incredible. It really is
Yeah,
incredible.
yeah. And Dan, also, if you want to shorten our name, we often call ourselves WRFI, which is kind of silly. Instead of just spelling out WRFI, we just say WRFI. So feel free to refer to us
That's
as
probably
WRFI if it's
easier
easier.
because I keep looking down because I'm like, I'm going to reverse the letters. I'm going to mess this up.
Totally. Just go,
We'll go
just
with
go
Murphy.
WRFI,
There you
WRFI.
go. There you go. So shifting a little bit to kind of leadership challenges, strategy. What do you think? What's one challenge that you're facing right now that you think a lot of nonprofit leaders would relate to?
I think, we're living in unprecedented times, and as a, I'd be happy to live in precedented times again at some point. Um, but I think, for a lot of organizations, sort of financial models that we built pre-COVID were upset during the pandemic, and even, some would say that we're 5 years out. I think we're more realistically a year, maybe 2 years out from the sort of biggest impacts of the pandemic and in communities that have been most affected. And so I think we're still really in a time of rebuilding the organizational structures and financial models that nonprofits are used to or were built around pre-pandemic. And then on top of that, as federal funding has been just chopped and changed and slashed, and I think that a lot of federal grants and awards have become less reliable than what they were in previous administrations. And so, again, we're just living in this really dynamic time when it comes to how nonprofits are funded and what we can expect in terms of that.
There's no question. It's a challenge, and even when I talk to people that, let's say, weren't relying on federal funding, so weren't necessarily affected by those cutbacks, they still say, one person put it to me, it was an ED, and he said, there's more fish swimming in my pond, meaning the ones who were getting federal funding are no longer, so they're going after now the same donor pool that I am or whatever, or the same corporate partnership. So it's just become what was already a very competitive landscape has become even more competitive and a little bit confusing. So yeah, And then when you threw
Yeah,
in
and I mean, for us, we're largely funded through student tuition dollars, and then through private philanthropy. We don't rely on federal funds directly in any way. But I will say, there's as we think about how the student loans are going to affect students' ability to attend colleges and universities, and kind of change the value proposition of college as it exists. Right? There's all kinds of kind of trickle down effects as colleges and universities have less funding. What departments are going to have to be funded through private philanthropy instead of through federal grant monies. All of those kind of pieces come into play for us as we think about how the trickle down effects of that will look as well.
right. Well, you bring up fundraising. So when we first spoke in 2024, you were probably several months into what was WRFI's first major fundraising campaign after relying solely on tuition up to that point in their history, which is pretty amazing. Um, what surprised you so far? First of all, I looked at the impact report. I read it in detail the other day. You guys are doing unbelievable versus that plan. You've kind of blown it away, which not a lot of organizations can say these days. But so what surprised you so far in that fundraising campaign that you've been in charge of, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent?
Yeah. So I guess maybe I'll step back a little further and tell a little bit more for your listeners about where we came from and kind of where we're going. And so, I started this organization about 3.5 years ago now. And when I came in, it was immediately post pandemic, and we were a 27-year-old organization, 28-year-old organization at that point. And up to that point, we had been kind of on a rotating, funding hamster wheel of student tuition. So we'd recruit students in the fall and winter, bring in student tuition dollars, start running programs in late spring. Our busiest season is right about now in July. Have a bunch of summer programs that happen, and then a fall semester program that tapers down. And as we get back into September, October, we recruit more students, and so the hamster wheel goes, right? Every year for us, August and September were sort of a really skinny time of year where it's like, how are we going to figure out funding and, what's going to work? And, be like, well, we got to recruit more students for next year and make that happen. And as a funding model, it worked pretty well when we were super small, as, running 2 or 3 classes. And as we grew and we have administrative costs and administrative, personnel and real sort of year-round stability as an organization, that funding model starts to become a little tricky to consistently offer, and to create that stability for staff. And so when I started, I knew that we were going to have to make a transition to be a more blended funding model that was, maybe 80% student tuition and 20% philanthropic dollars and that kind of thing. And we'd sort of started on a slow relationship building campaign in 2022 and into 2023 that was moving towards that as a long-term target. And frankly, our enrollment in 22 and 23 didn't support that being a long-term project. And it demanded, because of low enrollment, it demanded that we really focus on philanthropic dollars coming in the door really quickly in 2023. So when we kicked off our 30th year campaign, we had about an 8-week timeline, so 2 months, in which we had to raise $100,000 to literally keep the doors open, keep the lights on, keep students in the field, and kind of do what we needed to do. And for context, the organization in our previous, 28 years, we had raised about $180,000 organically, and then had a single $200,000 gift that came from a family foundation. And so the idea that we were going to, in 8 weeks, go out and raise $100,000 was just,
No pressure.
unprecedented times, right? And so, we looked at that and I said, yeah, this is going to keep the doors on, but keep the lights on and keep the doors open. But really, to move the organization to a place of financial stability, we need to think bigger than raising what we need right now. We need to raise $100,000 to make things happen this year. We need to raise another $200,000 to give us some stability going into the next, few years. And in an ideal world, we could also raise another $250,000 in pledges over a 5-year term that would give us kind of a consistent, revenue stream from donors who have made long-term pledges to the organization. And when I put all that on paper and brought it to, some long-term supporters of the organization, a couple of them looked at me like I had three heads and said, how is WRFI ever going to raise this money? And a couple of them looked at it and said, this makes total sense. This is just what we need to do. And, I think what has surprised me, so we raised the $100,000 in about 6 weeks, had a couple of, four and five figure anchor gifts in that initial campaign. We had 9 donors that gave it a $5,000 or $6,000 level. One donor that gave it about 20, and the rest in smaller $1,000 to $2,500 donations, 1,000 to 2,500, to close out that first phase. And then we launched into phase 2. Again, a couple of anchor donors in the $25,000 to $50,000 range, and filled in phase 2 with some other mid-size gifts in the 1,000 to 2,000 range. And then the phase 3 component of this long-term pledge campaign of 5 years, we had a number of families that have had students recently actually had students come through the organization, and they were able to make 5-year commitments at like $10,000 a year. And right towards the end, as we were, middle of the end of this campaign, we had one of our longest term families, the daughter of one of our founders, university contacts when they were in school, Terrell Erickson, recently had started a new conservation fund with her husband, Krister Puttick, and the two of them stepped up and made a transformational $150,000 gift towards this campaign, which pushed our total, just over 700,000 for the total campaign that had started out with a goal of about $500,000. So, I think one thing that surprised everybody was that we were successful in raising even what we set out to raise. And, the fact that we achieved 30% more almost than what we had set out was definitely surprising, I think, for our community. But I guess for me, what was most surprising was how much fun it is to connect with our community and hear the stories of this organization, hear how, our alumni have had their lives be changed, hear how impactful this is for parents whose university age students go through the program, and as they see their students change in front of their eyes and that kind of thing. It's just an amazing organization that I get to be a part of. And so that's been really, really fun and really cool to see.
All of that was amazing. I mean, you said so much, there's a lot to unpack. I mean, to me, the family, some of those big gifts and the recurring gifts for the pledges is really important because you send your kid off to school. I mean, I was there. I had 2 daughters in college that long out of college, and I'd get the call from their schools to donate money. I'd be like, I'm already paying tuition. Why am I
Yeah.
donating money? And it didn't resonate with me. My own college, my own alma mater, that's a different story. But you can see that the parents or the families saw something different in WRFI that their children went through. And that's, I think, why they got excited about it, which speaks really well to what you bring to the community. Have you found most of or a lot of the fundraising came through alumni of the program?
Yeah. So I'd say about, we actually pulled some data on this about 6 months ago, and we were looking at, how many of our donors were in different sort of key categories. So over our total history, about 30% of our donors have been from alumni, and 30% is actually former instructors, which was kind of surprising as well. But I think, the organization pulls in really passionate educators and professionals to be instructors. They really believe in the work that we do, and it's kind of what they've built their careers around in so many ways. And those folks are just as passionate about what we do as alumni who may have the more direct impact. And so, our instructor community has been a really important community of donors to steward and community members to pull back in and be a part. And then alumni is obviously another huge component as well. That last 30% or 40% is a mix of parents and then just other supporters in the community. And so I think there's part of what we're really working on doing these days, and this points back to our impact report that you had mentioned earlier, is telling the story of this organization. Because I think one of the biggest gaps that we've had in our infrastructure is storytelling. And we do this amazing work, we have this incredible impact, but we've never really tried to trumpet what we do from the hilltops, right? And to tell the story of our students in the field, to get out on podcasts, to create annual reports, to leverage all of the technologies that we have to really share what we're doing. And I think the more that we do that, the more positive feedback we get around that in terms of folks saying, "Wow, that's really amazing! Like, I'd love to share this with my community back at my school, or I'd love to, send a student, or I'd love to support you through a donation or that kind of thing." So all of those, I think, are really important pieces.
Oh, I agree with the storytelling. So first of all, if anyone should be shouting from the mountaintops, it's you guys because you're already up there, right? The students are up there.
Exactly,
They might
exactly.
as well yell. And I think, when you talk about that generation, they want to be advocates, they want to be influencers. So arming them with the right tools to tell the stories and share their experiences, I think is a huge win for you guys. And I'm a big believer that emotions drive actions. Data is important. The facts are important. That's good, important for trust and for verification and all that. But I think it's emotions that drive actions and stories drive emotions. So the more that you can have, your students, your alumni, your faculty share, and even, the quotes I've read in the impact report on your website, it talks about it being just a completely different and life-changing experience. And I think the more that gets out there, the better it's going to be in terms of what WRFI is able to accomplish, throughout the community. So you made a statement before about the hamster wheel. It's kind of, you call it the hamster wheel. I usually refer to it,
Sure.
nonprofits living paycheck to paycheck or the equivalent of paycheck to paycheck. Um, and you put a plan in place to really start looking at long-term sustainability, which is something the sector talks a lot about, but has really wrestled with, especially going through turbulent times. When we talk about sustainability for the nonprofit sector for WRFI, what does that actually look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's for a lot of nonprofits, uh, if they serve their missions well, eventually they'll serve their missions to the point where they don't have a job anymore, and that would be great, right? If we think about, let's say a food bank, if a food bank does their job as well as they possibly can, at some point, hopefully, they no longer will be necessary in their communities because people will have the food that they need and food security, and their services would no longer be needed. I think there's a lot of sort of traditional charities and organizations that fall in that category, and I think maybe the answer for those organizations might want to look different than the answer for an organization like us. I think that with an academic program, with our mission to inspire the next generation of environmental stewards and community leaders, there's always going to be a need for environmental stewardship and community leadership. That's always going to exist now, and it always has, and it always will. And so I think when I think about sustainability for an organization like WRFI, I would love to see us have the funding that we need to complete all of our administrative roles, um, be provided through a philanthropic support system. And so that our student tuition dollars are all going directly towards the programs in the field, which ultimately that means that we could offer more financial aid, reduce the cost of the courses, do all those kinds of things. Um, I think that's a really hard, that's a challenging piece to get there. And so that's what our challenge right now is to figure out how to build those systems. And probably long term, that looks like having an endowment for the organization. It looks like having endowed scholarships for the organization, for our students. It also looks like filling our courses to full enrollment, and that's a whole other side of our kind of funding equation, is that we do have this realized revenue from courses that we're offering in the field, and we have tuition dollars, and those pay for the program services, and that kind of fee for service revenue stream is kind of unique in the nonprofit world for compared to a lot of organizations as well. So I think long-term sustainability is going to be blending those together to create systems that mean that we are really confident in our annual budgeting process every year that we're going to have the funding we need to run the programs and have the students come on course that we want to have come.
No, that makes total sense. Something you kind of touched on now, but and you and I think had discussed last time when we met was the clarity of the mission. If you use your example of the food bank, very easy to understand. The food bank, their mission is to feed, the people in their community that have food insecurity. Okay, so very straightforward, shouldn't be misunderstood by donors and supporters. But do you think, with something like WRFI, which isn't as straightforward to know what your mission is just by looking at it, what do you think donor supporters often kind of misunderstand about the work that organizations like WRFI do?
I think it's understanding the impact, right? I think a lot of donors, and I think in my experience, where I've seen a lot of corporate donors in particular, where they look to uh, show that they're doing good in the world, right? Is to say, well, here's a food bank. They need to serve 1,000 people. We can donate, $1,000 and feed 1,000 people, right? And there's a very sort of transactional um, investment to impact moment that I think oftentimes um, donors are looking for, right? And when you're talking about a program like WRFI, our impact may be 5, 10, or 35 years down the road, or longer, right? Like we're only a 31-year-old organization. And some of our biggest impacts certainly come from alumni that were in our earliest courses. I mean, a great example of this is I met a woman who was a student on our first ever course in 1994, and her name's Jenny Madcore, and she's the district attorney in Multnomah County. And in talking with Jenny, she described how her experience with WRFI pointed her towards a profession in the legal, becoming an attorney and then eventually becoming the DA. And she now is involved in a number of sort of cases that involve suing large oil companies for climate change. And so when I think about our mission of that next generation of environmental stewards and community leaders, I mean, Jenny's a perfect example for us as an organization to say, yeah, that's the impact that we have, is that these multinational, oil conglomerates are being held accountable for climate change in the ways that they should be. Um, that's a really hard thing. In 1994, if we had approached a corporate sponsor and said, "Hey, would you fund this program? And 30 years from now, there's going to be this really important court case that one of our alumni is going to, be leading." Like, that's a really challenging impact to demonstrate in a, dollars in, impact out kind of way. But I think a lot of these types of programs, whether it's WRFI or other outdoor education, kind of any educational initiative, it's oftentimes going to be a long time before you see that impact.
Right. But now, now that you're 30 years in, like the one you just told me, you do have some of those stories to share, which is
Right.
that is the impact. And to me, creating these leaders, these change makers is a way for systemic change instead of what I'll call the Band-Aid approach of just, raising money and having a program and fixing one little thing. That's, cleaning up, the national parks. Great. Right. But
Right.
that's just temporary. They're going to get messed up again the following week. And it's a Band-Aid
Right.
approach versus, real change. So I think a lot of it's in the storytelling, but I could see how it would be more difficult. I mean, environmental issues in general are harder. People want to support the environment, but it's just harder to get your brains around impact because it's potentially far off in the future. There's no question about it.
Yeah, I think it's always a balance, right? I mean, there's a lot of conservation foundations right now that are really focused on conserving land and putting conservation easements into place. And I think there's a real, just using that landscape as a case study, there's a real sort of dire time-based concern around putting land into conservation. And so a lot of organizations are really focused on that specific issue right now, compared to a systemic approach like what we have, which is ultimately, I think, a lot of our alumni end up in conservation work in one way or another. But if that land isn't conserved now, then like what's going to happen with it? Is it still going to be open
Right.
space 20 years
Absolutely.
from now? And so how do you find a balance? As a funder, I have a lot of empathy for how complicated that equation has to be for them as well, and for figuring out what those priorities look like.
Right. So let me ask you this little fun question. If somebody gave Worthy tomorrow a $1 million unrestricted gift, what would you do with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Right now, we're in the middle of a 3-year strategic plan, which has to do with storytelling, has to do with increasing our enrollment. All of our goals are focused on kind of those long-term foundation laying stability pieces. So I think if somebody gave us a $1 million unrestricted gift tomorrow, my first instinct would be to stick that into an endowment fund and keep doing our strategic plan in the exact same way that we had planned ahead of time. I think one of the things. So I worked for over 10 years as an outdoor educator. I was on search and rescue teams. I was a park ranger. I've done a bunch of work in the outdoors, and one of the things that's taught me is that to recognize when something is an emergency and when something is not, like sort of a true emergency and when it's not. And I think if somebody gave us $1 million unrestricted gift tomorrow, that wouldn't constitute an emergency where we need to throw our hands up in the air and change our priorities or change what we're doing. I think if anything, it would say we just need to stay the course and keep going the direction we are, and stick to the strategic plan with a little bit more resource available to us in the future.
I think the only emergency is make sure you send the thank you note. I think that would be important.
I think that one might be an in-person visit, even
Yeah, I think
not even
so.
just a phone call. It would be a little bit more than that. Yeah.
But I agree with you. I do think some nonprofits get guided by the gift and shift courses or get away from, what the strategic plan was versus just saying, great, this gives us stability, this gives us security, and it gives us the ability to talk about other strategic initiatives as we're doing our planning because we'll have the funding. But don't shift on a dime because that's never a good idea in any type of business to make decisions like that. So let's end on a positive. I think, while, like you said, there's a lot of chaos going on, a lot of stuff being thrown at nonprofits these days. You guys are actually doing wonderfully in terms of the plan you set out for a couple of years ago and your growth and the fundraising campaign. I happen to believe the it's at a little bit of a tipping point, but at the same point, I think there's so many positive trends for social good in general. So I'm just curious from your standpoint, Matt, what gives you hope right now in the world of social good?
I think it's our students. I kind of am in a unique role where I get to directly interface with about 60 young people every year. We have 60 students next year. Hopefully, it's 80. Year after that, maybe 100. As we continue to grow our enrollment, I have the opportunity to meet with all of these young people who are in college and kind of in that phase of young adulthood and figuring out the world before them. And um, our students give me hope. They are really inspirational, that they are here learning, thinking critically, challenging their belief systems, wanting to see social impact in the meaningful ways and environmental impacts in the meaningful ways that we teach about, but also that they're taking these courses to learn more about. And so I think, you know, that's really a place where on a daily, monthly, yearly basis, I see hope for our communities to come together, to learn together, to challenge the status quo and to make the world a better place.
Awesome. Awesome. I love it. I do think there's a lot of positives, and I think, a lot of it comes from the younger generations, and I'm fine with that. I've got a lot of faith in what they can do for the world and the fact that they want to make real change and be part of communities and groups that are making a difference. And I think that bodes well for the future of the world. So, Matt, this was great. Thank you for just the honest take on and the stories behind the work. I know people, when they listen, they're going to walk away with a deeper appreciation for what leadership looks like in this sector, especially when you're balancing purpose, people, and when you talk about whatever the time frame was to raise that first $100,000, a heck of a lot of pressure, some of it on the short term. And for those of you watching this, if you're not familiar with WRFI, please check them out. They're a very innovative organization doing things differently. They've got some great testimonials on there from current students, former students, faculty. It's a very innovative organization that's heading in the right direction. So check them out. I'll drop the links in here so you can go to their website and see what they're all about. And if it matches up with your values and you can find a way to support them, that would be awesome. And for everyone out there that's working in or around the nonprofit world, whether that's executive directors, fundraisers, CSR folks, consultants, this is the kind of conversation I want to keep having. So stay tuned. Matt, thank you again. And hopefully, maybe we'll get to do a round two sometime in the not too distant future, maybe somewhere beautiful outdoors in the state of Montana.
Absolutely, Dan. You're welcome anytime. Well, while I have you, I'm just going to throw out one other quick project that we've been working on. So one of our alums, Ava Happy, has a podcast called the Shadows Run podcast, and we're just now kind of starting to announce this to the world. But Ava's going to be releasing a series of 6 different conversations with. I'm the first one, which I'm incredibly embarrassed about, but first with me, and then with 5 other voices from the WRFI community. So alumni, instructors, one of our founders is going to be on there. So that's going to be coming out in the next few weeks, and I'll definitely put something on my LinkedIn and on WRFI's social media. But if you're curious about the organization and want to hear more about our impact and hear more about kind of what we do, I'd point to that as a great place to hear some of those stories and connect a little bit further. And then, like you said, if anyone wants to connect with me ever, look me up on my LinkedIn or on the website. My email is pretty simple. It's matt@wrfi.net. And we'd love to stay connected.